Kicking us off, we wanted to start the day with a bit of a global overview. And so these two papers and presenters here, we thought did that. So we wanted to start off with reflections from Dr. Alice Evatt, and she'll be talking to us about how we can think about carbon removal budgeting in relation to carbon take-back obligations and geological storage mandates. So Alice is a research fellow in Net Zero for the fossil fuel sector. She's based here at Oxford. She's also a fellow at Kellogg College and has done a number of really critical research pieces looking at carbon removal supply and, again, how we manage that too. But really interestingly, has a background in kind of climate ethics, and so again, I think will be a really excellent person for us to help unpack some of the ethical dimensions of carbon removal budgeting and the moral hazard type of questions that arise in that regard too. And also acknowledging that other collaborators in the room, including Professor Miles Allen on the paper, are here today. And then we have Jacopo Bencini, and he is a research associate over at the EUI over in Florence, and we're really grateful to hear his insights today. He's got a wealth of experience in carbon markets, carbon pricing, including at the international level, including Article 6, and will offer some really critical insights in terms of how a concept such as carbon removal budgeting can actually be thought of in terms of these big international frameworks, so whether it's the UNFCCC, whether it's even corporate planning and the kind of standards that inform that. It'll be really interesting to hear Jacopo's insights about how the carbon removal budget can kind of inform these multi-layers of governance, and we can really think from that kind of global perspective to that local perspective, including in sessions throughout the day. So I'll now hand over the podium to Alice to kick us off. Welcome, Alice. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Injy. Thank you, Ben, as well, not only for such a nice introduction and overview of the CRB, but coming up with the CRB in the first place, because I think it's quite neat. So I'm going to, as Injy said, walk you through one way that I think the CRB could play out. You've already heard who I am. I work alongside Miles Allen, who's in the room here as well. And what I do is primarily work on policy solutions to scale the net zero technologies we really need, right? And that includes, first and foremost, geological storage, but it also includes CDR, carbon dioxide removal. And I was really lucky to be able to lead Oxford's final deliverable of the NEGEM project in Europe, which was an EU Horizon project looking at quantifying and deploying responsible negative emissions. And so when I thought, we saw this paper, Carbon Removal Budget, and I thought, okay, this is kind of interesting. And then I saw the call for the symposium, looking at one of the questions, how do we embed the CRB? And I thought, okay, that's even more interesting. And I thought, okay, what could we do? And I work with not only Miles Allen, but I work with Dr. Stuart Jenkins. I work with a great team called the Carbon Balance Initiative with Ingrid Sundborg and Murda Boot, also a DPhil student, Petra Bissek. And we've been working a lot on geological storage, and I thought, well, maybe this could be an opportunity to implement it. Right? And so what I'm going to do is talk you through this. I'm going to talk first about this concept of geological net zero, then geological storage mandates, and then finally look at, well, could the CRB be a useful tool here? So, you might think, well, hang on, why is she talking about geological storage, right? Because a lot of work with the carbon dioxide removal has to be done with nature-based methods. And here you can look at the net land use emissions in the 1.5 scenarios, and there is an awful lot of stuff going on with nature-based CDR. 0.4 trillion tons of CO2 restored to the biosphere by 2100. It's significant. And very importantly, this doesn't include passive sinks and uptake. But it's not sufficient, right? So this is a picture of what's happening now. We are emitting more emissions from the geosphere and emissions from land use and land use change. And so we've got, the Earth is heating up. There's CO2 in the atmosphere. And so we need to reach net zero. And what a lot of corporate and national net zero plans do at the moment is that they're predominantly capturing CO2 in the biosphere, in the ocean sphere. And so this means the emissions are going out and they're being balanced here. And that's okay, but it's a bit problematic, right? Because this will only really result in a temporary net zero. Why is that? It's because in the biosphere, the ability of the biosphere to take up CO2 is limited, right? It also is not permanent in the sense of being 1,000 years plus without human intervention, which is what the geosphere and geological storage can provide. Adding to that is that climate change and CO2 might change the ability of the biosphere to take up CO2, and it might also result in risk of reversal. And so how do we get around this? We're looking at a concept of durable net zero. How do we reach and sustain net zero? And this is requiring what Injy was describing, a like-for-like principle. So you balance emissions from the geosphere to the atmosphere and back, so emissions from fossil fuel-based origin, and then you balance emissions from the land sector and the atmosphere. And if you do that, you get to geological net zero. But reaching geological net zero requires more than just engineered removals, right? And I'll explain it by walking you through this. So here, you see in the red line, geological CO2 production, and this is industrial CO2 production and storage in technology-neutral 1.5 scenarios. That is coal, oil, gas, and limestone. In the blue line there, you've also got the geological CO2 storage, right, that would be needed. And that often isn't mapped. And that includes CCS, carbon capture and storage, as well as direct air capture with CCS and bioenergy with CCS, BECCS, DACs. Those are the engineered removals there. And so to get to geological net zero, this point here becomes very important, right? This is geological net zero, and that is production minus storage equals geological net zero. So what that means, to reach it, you need to drastically reduce geological CO2 production, reduce fossil fuels. You need to increase geological storage with both CCS and BECCS and DACs. And essentially, we need to scale from 0.1 available today, 0.1%, to 100% to reach net zero, geological net zero by 2050. This is just another way of demonstrating it. Before we were looking at one scenario. Now we're looking at gross energy industrial CO2 production in 1.5 scenarios. And you can see a lot of geological storage is presumed. So in a nutshell, you need to produce less and store more, or as Miles likes to say, you need to stop fossil fuels from causing global warming before the world stops using fossil fuels. So, geological storage, like CDR and like Injy and Ben have pointed out so well, geological storage is also finite. It's also limited by a whole range of constraints, technological, economic, physical, and like CDR, it's really hard to scale, right? And so the big question that we've been looking at is, how do you finance it, right? How do you scale it up and commercialize it? And this is where we've been doing a lot of work. And to break it down in a really simple way, and I'm very aware I'm in the room filled with financiers. This is not correct, but it's a good way of breaking it down. So I like to think there are two kinds of monies and two kinds of policy. You've got private money, public money, market mechanisms, and subsidy and public funding, in general. And so the question of how do we scale storage, people have been going back and forth between these almost like a chicken and egg. Which one are we going to use? Well, private money, and using things like market mechanisms, carbon pricing has really proven ineffective at scaling geological storage. And that's not breaking news, right? We've known this for some time. If you flip to the other side, and a lot of fossil fuel companies like this side, they say, well, we'll use public money. And in the US, you saw 45Q, the Inflation Reduction Act, which was doing just that. It was putting forth money to develop both permanent storage, but also 180 per tonnes for DACs. But the problem with that is it's not finite. It's subject to change, almost with political change, almost it can change overnight. Public taxpayers might kick up a stink, and other countries simply can't compete with the US level. So what are we left with? What our team's been working on is another solution. We look at mandates, right? And so now we come to the second part of the talk. What are mandates? Mandates, unlike market mechanisms or unlike carbon pricing, which look at behaviour change, mandates are about action, right? And they're very flexible. So you can mandate various things, such as you can have a transport mandate, saying zero-emission car sales must reach 100% by 2030. You can have heat mandates, power mandates, and in fact, mandates as a policy mechanism have been increasingly being recognised as a really powerful and effective tool to scale hard-to-fund net zero technologies, right? They've been described as having a positive tipping point or tipping cascade power. And while this is focusing on energy, heat and power and transport, increasingly it's being looked at in regards to geological storage. One example, I don't talk about it here, but I have elsewhere, is the European Union in the Net Zero Industry Act recently put in an obligation on oil and gas producers to provide CO2 injection capacity, right? And that's a mandate. So I'm going to run you through some supply-side storage mandates, and don't worry, I will get to the CRB. I know I've been talking a lot about geological storage. But here's one way we could really ramp up geological storage. You could have a supply-side storage mandate, and this is what the carbon take-back obligation essentially is. So if you want to know more about this, you can look at that literature. This is gaining traction quite slowly at first, but more and more rapidly. In the UK, Netherlands, Norway, EU, in some circles it's being discussed in Australia. It mandates producers and importers of fossil origin carbon to have to provide storage, to have to store. It's grounded then in a kind of polluter pays responsibility framework. It requires them to geologically store an increasing proportion of CO2. And that includes the CO2 their products generate, right? So it's really that supply side, not the demand side. And to reach geological net zero, you need to have a geological stored fraction of CO2 of their products scaled up to 100% stored by net zero. Now, you could say that in another way. Rather than scaling up the amount of CO2 stored to 100%, you could say, well, you can flip it and have a net geological carbon intensity. So the fraction of all CO2 produced that remains above ground is this, and we need to get to net zero here. So assuming that all the scenarios start reducing net geological carbon intensity at the same time, right? And here we've corrected for differences in time to get to halfway to net zero. This final result shows you really what it takes to get fossil fuels to stop causing global warming. And that is what the supply-side mandate would help to bring about. Now, there's a risk though, right? And it's without clear policy, I think there's a real risk that engineered CDR, BECCS and DACs might struggle to access geological storage infrastructure, even with the supply-side mandate. Why? Well, because like geological storage, CDR is also really expensive, especially the engineered types like BECCS and DACs especially. And so how does CDR operate in a supply-side storage mandate? Well, there's no dedicated access for CDR. It's shaped by market forces. This doesn't guarantee CDR scale-up. It might support it in a way, so it doesn't say, oh, well, no CDR can happen, but it relies on the market to drive it. So if fossil fuel CO2 becomes scarce or costly, if point source capture it remains difficult, maybe CDR will scale up then. But there's a risk that independent CDR actors might be excluded or priced out from accessing injection capacity and storage. And early movers and large players may dominate access, right? So first mover problem. So could there be a solution? Well, before the CRB came along, we were thinking maybe you could implement a CDR sub-target into this mandate. What would that look like? You could embed a sub-target for atmospheric CO2. This would ensure that a portion of storage is used for removals, not just CCS point source capture. For instance, let's say, for example, 40% of storage is used for CDR, atmospheric CDR by net zero. It aims to guarantee that access for CDR actors, and it strengthens demand signals, investment, and it's good for social license too, because a lot of people, when you mention geological storage, they go, oh, that's a license to extend fossil fuel use. But you remember that big red line, fossil fuel use has to come down. So using it for CDR could help. But I think this might only be a partial solution, because while it might help carve out access and signal ambition, it doesn't really solve how much CDR is needed or who gets access. The targets, where does that 40% target come from? It's kind of picked out of the air. It might lack a justification if it's not anchored in a robust CDR needs framework. The fixed percentage, as I've just said, can feel arbitrary. It might quickly become misaligned with needs. And if you do too much, if you say, okay, you should have this amount for CDR too early, it might crowd out cheaper points or CCS, which will hinder the scale-up of all geological storage. Too little risks underscaling or sidelining CDR. How do we solve this? And I thought, well, maybe the CRB could help. So this is 2.B redefined, a supply-side storage mandate with CRB-informed CDR sub-target. This would, or could, anchor obligations and independently assess CRB pathways, be that international, domestic, sectoral, corporation level, avoid the fixed sub-targets that might be arbitrary or misaligned, support coordination of planning, access and use, and it might just help ensure fair access for independent CDR operators. Might. Potential benefits? Well, this might be a benefit not just for geological storage, but for the CRB, an opportunity to operationalise it into policy. And let me remind you, mandates are already starting to happen. I already mentioned the EU Net Zero Industry Act, Article 23. It supports scaling, equitable use of storage, a principled basis for resolving these tensions between CCS and CDR operators. And it moves beyond that kind of ad hoc allocation towards something more transparent, needs-based. And I think, to conclude really, it warrants further exploration. But I wouldn't be doing my due diligence if I didn't point out the limitations and the challenges. A CRB-informed sub-target, can it decide who gets what and why? That's a very political, maybe even philosophical question. It's very value-laden. And I'll jump to point 3 there. A risk of reproducing carbon budget-style disputes over fair shares. And I think we can all kind of remember how that argument went. Who gets what? Why? And you can have, in the paper, they've picked out, Injy and Ben, these different principles and issues, equity, responsibility, ability to pay per capita. But each one leads to different outcomes. So which one do you pick? Also, storage supply and CDR demand are both still very uncertain. So is there a risk of calling it too soon? And governance frameworks, I think, would still be required to interpret and implement CRB pathways. But despite these challenges, could a geological storage mandate be a tool to operationalise it? I reckon it's something to think about. Right? So thank you.
Wonderful, thank you, Alice. We'll now head over to Jacobo, and we will have time for Q&A at the end of the session. Thank you.
Right. Perfect. I can see my slides on the podium. Yet, at least. Right, well, I can start in any case. Right, so thank you very much for the invitation. My name is Jacopo Bencini. I work at the European University Institute, School of Transnational Governance. I see some faces that I know already for some of our annual events in the room. So glad to have you here as well, and glad to be here discussing the carbon removal budget and this new concept. We wrote a paper together with my colleague Laura Iozzelli titled Challenges and Opportunities in Mainstreaming the Carbon Removal Budget Across the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, and Corporate Net Zero Strategy. I'm still not seeing my slides on the podium, but fine. All right. Yes, I work as a research associate at the UI. I'm a political scientist as a background with some years of experience in negotiations at the UNFCCC level, and currently I'm working mainly on intersections between carbon pricing, carbon markets, voluntary carbon markets with an S at the end, in Article 6, and I wrote this paper together with my colleague Laura Iozzelli, research fellow at the UI. She works mainly on sustainable finance and sustainable reporting rules, and she also works as a senior associate researcher for the Brussels School of Governance. In this upcoming 20 to 25 minutes that we have, we will go through some introduction to the research context and objectives for this paper I am presenting, comparisons with the carbon budget concept, but that was already highlighted by Injy and Ben. I thank you for this. Then we will get to our research methodology, and then to our findings in terms of the possible integration of the concept in these three domains, and the scope is the one we highlighted there, and I will get later to why we choose these three and how. Then we will get to our findings and some possible avenues for further research. In terms of the context, there is, of course, a growing need for carbon dioxide removal and carbon dioxide removal governance along emission reductions. This has already been quite clear since the first two interventions in the morning, but there is a lack of clarity in governance, in planning, in allocation, and that's perhaps one of the most interesting and promising parts of the new concept being developed. The emergence of this new concept that you invented somehow, the carbon removal budget, could be seen as a complement to the carbon budget concept. This has been said already in the morning. Perhaps we can add a question mark there, but that's for the very ending of my presentation. And I have to admit here that as authors of this paper, we are biased, and the bias is that we think that this concept is useful. Somehow we underline that in the paper already. We have been asking around during our events at the UI whether other people have heard about this paper, and it's interesting to see some of them here today. When it comes to the research objectives, well, in the original paper from last year, there were two paragraphs which we found very interesting: climate negotiations and corporate transition planning. So we decided to ask ourselves which factors might facilitate or impede the integration of this new concept into these domains, and specifically the UNFCCC climate regime. We decided to enlarge the scope of the research by also analyzing the UN CBD biodiversity regime. We will get to the how and why. And for corporate transition planning and corporate net zero strategies, we decided to tackle SBTI in the version of what was the new draft until some weeks ago. In terms of building parallels with the carbon budget, well, we know that it gained legitimacy over the years as the UNFCCC switched from stabilization goals initially with the convention to a more target-oriented approach, and this already signals something. also based on the other presentations that we have, that we had. We know that the carbon budget made its appearance in IPCC article assessment report number 5 in 2014 already as a relevant metric for policy making, and I quote. And then with the Paris Agreement, we had these global goals finally written on paper in the most higher level treaty-based agreement on climate change. Then at COP28 in 2023, we had an entire paragraph 25 of the first global stocktake decision devoted entirely to the to the carbon budget, not as a concept anymore, but as a fact, as findings. And in this sense, also to comment on the original paper on the carbon removal budget, the carbon budget itself did not obtain a specific dedicated negotiation track called carbon budgeting, but it slowly entered the UNFCCC through other ways. In this sense, some parallels could be built. Both the CRB and the CB, sorry for using acronyms, are quantitative science-based tools to guide climate action, to inform climate governance, in this case specifically focused on carbon removals. They both support target setting and planning from the global to each corporate level, and they involve, this is interesting in terms of further research, they both involve uncertainty on the methodologies, on the methods, on how these budgets are being calculated, and that is stated also by the IPCC if you read through the reports. At the same time, they both provide availability, limits, and stress goals, which is something policymakers really need at the moment. We decided to base our analysis on a very simple method, if you want, a SWOT analysis, slightly readapted for the goal. So we used the SWOT framework with strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. I'm not telling anything new in the room. And how to analyze these three domains, how to build this analysis. We decided to base our analysis on the text when it comes to the first two domains, UNFCCC and UNCBD. We try to walk in the shoes of possible negotiators or policymakers entering the room at the negotiations, as well as for the SBTI relevant stakeholders or key decision makers in that endeavor. This kind of work should be based on the text. Of course, we know that especially for the two UN conventions, we are in a treaty-based environment, and what it's written in the existing text, depending also on the hierarchy of the text, of course, but is the base of the further work. So in both cases, for the two conventions, we took the convention, and then for the UNFCCC, the Paris Agreement, of course, and also, and this is perhaps a debatable part of our work, but we decided to proceed nonetheless, the first global stocktake decision, which in theory should inform how the Paris Agreement gets implemented over the next few years and decades. And I'm saying in theory because we already saw in Baku that there are some pushbacks in that sense. When it comes to the UN Convention on Biodiversity, we took both the convention and the Kunming-Montreal Protocol from 2022, which, as you know, sets clear goals and targets for biodiversity conservation worldwide, and we will get there in a minute. For SBTI, we decided to work on the draft standard at the time of the writing of this paper. As you know, there has been a consultation going on, and we analyzed the latest version of that. We thought of identifying some region-specific factors and potential, and as well some cross-domain factors which could have influenced this mainstreaming and this integration. So in just more 30 seconds on the analytical framework, as said, the methodology that we used has been slightly adapted to the enterprise in that sense. So for strengths, in the next few slides, I will mean internal enablers to integration of the new concept, internal to the text, okay, internal to the domain, weaknesses, as well internal limitations. And for opportunities and threats, external trends, external factors likely to promote, facilitate, or undermine this integration. So we'll start from the UNFCCC. In terms of internal strengths, there's a very straightforward thing to say at the beginning. integrating the carbon removal budget into this domain is extremely aligned with the goals of both the Convention and the Paris Agreement. And I know that there are some people with experience as negotiators in the room, that having a clear mandate which is based on the treaty is key in this sense towards possible integration. The goal of the Paris Agreement and the Convention themselves is based on the presence, and then thus we assume also the governance of CDR in the policy mix. As well, the role of removals has been fortified over negotiations over time, from the UNFCCC to Paris and the first global stocktake decision, where, as well as you know, engineered removals are mentioned for the first time in this endeavor. When it comes to external opportunities, developments in the sector, of course, are pushing for clearer and stronger governance and guidance from multilateral actors and national actors as well. High-level governance, and the CRB, we assume, could be an instrument in that sense. And some countries might also see the carbon removal budget as instrumental towards the further developing of Articles 4 and 14 of the Paris Agreement, which means NDCs and how to make it, and next global stocktake decisions in the next few years. In terms of weaknesses internal to this ecosystem, we have to admit that UNFCCC Paris Agreement and also, to some extent, the GST Decision 1 are mainly focused on nature-based solution. And this also reflects where this whole conversation comes from Rio 92 and previous developments in that sense. As well, Article 5 of the Paris Agreement, if we want to talk about political mandates to negotiate, talks about removals by focusing only on forest-based applications. So this could be a limitation, of course. Then, needless to say, but useful to say, the UNFCCC is a party-driven process, is consensus-based decision-making. That means that if a single country or a small group, even a small group of countries, oppose the decision or even the idea to include a reference to this concept into some, well, whichever level of decision at some point or at some COP or at some intersessionals, that the whole process could be blocked. And this is a clear limitation. As well, there are timeframes under the Paris Agreement in terms of the global stocktake and new NDCs to be published, which perhaps might not align well with the carbon removal budget as a moving target, as a dynamic target, as we heard in the morning. In terms of external threats, perhaps non-acceptance or how can I say, not far-working levels of acceptance in some national cases could undermine the emergence of the concept at the multilateral level. And as well, being a moving target could create some mistrust from some key stakeholders at the national level towards the target. And one key point to add here is that the carbon removal budget and everything related to budgeting when it comes to removals is also based on the definition of residual emissions globally, internationally, and we know that we don't have a clear definition for that. Finally, distributional implications, equity, we have been hearing something about that in the morning already, could perhaps clash with national priorities for some countries if they happen to actually apply carbon removal budgeting in their case and see what happens. And common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, which, as you know, is a core principle in this endeavor. When it comes to biodiversity, the Biodiversity Convention, the Convention says that countries should work on balancing, creating a balance between conservation and the use of ecological complexes. If you go to read what ecological complexes are under the Convention, we're mainly talking about forests. So, in this sense, the potential, the CO2 potential of integrating the carbon removal budgeting here could have some political space. And we are seeing this conversation already happening with nature credits and how they intersect with other carbon market instruments. With the Kunming-Montreal framework, we have some goals and targets in the framework with create further space for the integration of carbon removal budgeting or governance instruments for governing removals. Of course, this ecosystem is limited to nature-based solutions, much more than the UNFCCC, as we have seen. This can represent an opportunity as well, in the sense to test the concept in an ecosystem, in a political endeavor that we know better. as nature-based solutions have been developed over years, and also in terms of methodologies and reporting, with all the limits that we have heard in the morning already. Otherwise, the carbon removal budgeting could also inform the COP at a higher level in terms of high-level discussions, if we want, if not really applied country per country or globally, but could serve as an instrument to steer conversations. When it comes to external opportunities, on the other hand, we thought, by reading your paper, that some integrity challenges felt as challenges at the local level, at the national level, when it comes to big projects, for instance, that involve land use and land appropriation by some companies, for instance, or some multi-stakeholder initiatives, who knows, can create demand for carbon removal budgeting in terms of setting guardrails, in terms of setting evidence-based limits to how carbon removal projects could land in this kind of land. And it's interesting to see that under the Kunming-Montreal framework, there are some sections and paragraphs which could provide the political space for this concept to, sorry for repeating myself in terms of verbs, to land in this sense, in this ecosystem. And this could be something interesting further exploring. When it comes to internal weaknesses, we already said that it's limited to nature-based solutions when we talk about the UN CBD. And again, it's a party-driven process, is consensus-based decision-making, so it requires global acceptance of the concept, not to have a single country or a small group of countries objecting the idea. When it comes to external threats, we have to say that CDR and biodiversity conservation are still politically, at the international level, seen as two very different concepts. And there could be some ideological reasons, theoretical reasons, not to have more links or touching points between the two, also based on ideas on the commodification of nature, and so on. Moreover, the removal potential of nature-based solutions, which are central in this endeavor, change over time. And this could add complexity to an already intricate governance interplay in this possible integration pathway. And as well, and again, carbon removal budgeting at a national level could perhaps clash with some national plans, based on over-planning, over-reliance on removal solutions. And there's a vast literature growing in that sense. When it comes to companies and corporate net zero strategies, there are some interesting factors which could help integrate this concept into SBTI-based corporate plans. First of all, the new draft, let's call it the new standard for simplicity now, integrated interim and final removal targets, explicit for companies, durability and quality categories, transparency and reviews over time and rules in that sense. And also there's a strong push for efforts beyond value chain mitigation as a complementary effort in terms of possible removal of CO2 from the atmosphere. In terms of opportunities, there is an increasing demand for credible strategies in that sense. And you all know how this debate is evolving. So perhaps this kind of instrument could arrive as a benchmark, as a tool to be used, as something to refer to when you promote your own strategy as a corporate actor. Could be an instrument to strengthen legitimacy of corporate climate claims, and coming from the European University Institute, you know all the debate there we have on claims at the European Commission level, and also expand and strengthen capacity and investment in CDR. There is a small paragraph in our paper, which I'm not sure we will keep after these weeks, on the importance of this possible integration towards, for high-emitting sectors and specifically oil and gas. You will know that under SBTI, a new standard has been put on hold because of the withdrawal of a big actor in that sense. So perhaps there are some thoughts to be developed. Weaknesses. The carbon removal budget as it is at the moment is mainly a global concept. So a question from corporate actors in the room could be how to apply this on a firm-specific level, how to apply it to my company, how to apply it to my sector. And in this sense, the concept might need further sophistication, perhaps, and methodologies for applying this budgetary logic at the very individual level. When it comes to threats, external threats, oversight is key, because otherwise we could easily get to greenwashing in terms of labeling some investments as CRBOK, and this is definitely not the direction we want to walk. The concept could be misused by companies to perhaps delay reductions. We have been hearing something about that in the morning already, and really needs safeguards and guardrails in terms of methodologies. So, not to annoy you here with regime-specific potentials and cross-regime potentials, I will try to be a bit faster, as the analysis is basically the same that I have shown you so far, and then get to the conclusion. But the main thing that emerges when it comes to the UNFCCC is that even without a dedicated negotiation track, as suggested by the authors of the original paper, there could be space at the UNFCCC level, because it aligns with the goal, as we said. And there's also an emphasis on the equitable distribution of climate solutions. This is something which we read all across the three documents, sometimes understated perhaps, but very interesting also in terms of linking with the idea of how the CRB should work. And again, it could contribute to some of the articles of the Paris Agreement in terms of further developing. When it comes to biodiversity, we see that it is very, the Kunming-Montreal framework provided very specific targets and goals, and there could be a political space in that sense, but again, positions against this kind of linkage, because then it's very easy for many in the sector to link immediately budgeting as a word to markets and market-based approaches and everything that has been discussed over the past 30 years under the three Rio Conventions. When it comes to corporate target setting, just to summarize here, there's plenty of positives. There's plenty of plus towards the possible integration or mainstreaming in the under SBTI as well. As we said, the standard requires companies to set removal targets, not just targets anymore. There is a distinction in the draft between high and low durability in CDR solution and how well this aligns with the concept we found. There is a stronger recognition of beyond value chain mitigation, I've already said that. And there's also a point on how stakeholders and consumers, if you want in some cases, could push for this kind of development, also to have some points on their geography in terms of how to orient and steer further investments in these companies or building partnerships. At the same time, there are some minuses in this endeavor, as we really it is really needed for the carbon removal concept to move beyond the current form and to develop some more methodological underpinnings, and in this sense also to help the currently extremely fragmented governance of what we are talking about. In terms of cross-domain findings, and I'm getting to a close in a few seconds, there are of course some similarities between the two Rio Conventions, but useful to repeat because it could be also interesting to have a detached view on the various sectors in that sense. It's both a plus and a minus that under the conventions, removals are treated mainly as nature-based solutions. We can decide where to start testing this concept, perhaps, whether to keep a global perspective on all kinds of applications or whether to keep it tested in a more limited endeavor. Consensus ruling is a real limit in that sense, in both the conventions and in both these ecosystems. And again, a very large consensus on the carbon removal budget should have to emerge over the next few years to have it emerging in some of those discussions at some point, but it keeps years. And for the carbon budget in turn, it took a decade of discussions at the IPCC level, even before the UN rooms. And again, let's not underestimate the possible clashes between national policies, common but differentiated responsibilities, and what we are talking about in terms of distributional effects. When it comes to UNFCCC and SBTI and corporate level target setting, timeframes are key here. If you already have timeframes set under the standard or under the convention or under the Paris Agreement, you should make sure that what you are proposing, theoretically, methodologically, could, in theory, align with those timelines that are already there. And at the same time, it's useful also to remind that SBTI might not review its own standard in the next few years, as soon as the new standard will be published. What is shared across all regimes is that the concept is new, for sure, and starting from this symposium on what will be needed will be multilateral international recognition of the concept itself, not even the methodologies at this stage, but the concept as useful. And then we will need standardized methodologies for budgeting. And finally, this is a new point compared to the rest that I've said so far, civil society support. We thought while writing the paper that perhaps having some big organizations, big NGOs, big civil society names advocating for a carbon removal budget in the negotiations or under SBTi could be interesting to have further developments. I think that I've already jumped somehow to the conclusions of our paper. For sure, the UNFCCC will be the most fertile place where to have this mainstreaming, where to observe this integration, even, as said, without a dedicated negotiation track. Perhaps it could be even be easier without that. And for the corporate sector, definitely methodological sophistication will be needed for each company to engage with the concept. Yes, further research. By trying to answering our first research question, we noticed that we had hundreds more, of course, as it always happens when we do research. What are the implications of these integrations / mainstreaming into multilateral regimes or corporate and zero pathways? What could happen? That's something we didn't explore so far. Is it possible to determine different integration levels? Integration is a concept we didn't explore in depth at the moment. Integration and mainstreaming, we kept them as a concept there, but there could be different levels. What is the most appropriate level of integration in that sense? Should parallels with the carbon budget concept continue guiding our reasoning or not? Question mark. Perhaps there could be some actors not really happy with this kind of original research question. In terms of distributional and political dimensions, what are the implications across countries and sectors, as already heard in the morning? What could be the potential barriers, or how can this lack of consensus on CDR in general be a part of this story in this mainstreaming or integration? And when it comes to concept development and application, it could be interesting to understand how the carbon removal budget could be integrated with maritime CDR, which is a question I received while talking about the CRB over some conferences recently, and as well, how could it adapt to sector-specific context? Finally, will this concept prove solid and flexible enough as methodologies evolve, even in the building of this concept? Further, I would like to thank you, and of course, I'm here to answer your questions in case you have. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much both for these fantastic presentations and to kick us off with both some specific insights into policy integration into geological storage mandates, but equally in terms of this high-level fact that there's a number of policy frameworks and processes at work under play with various ways in which to then embed and integrate a concept such as the carbon removal budget, but there's complexities, and I think the SWOT analysis here was really helpful in terms of framing some of the big picture questions about carbon removal budgeting's utility, but equally the practical challenges, and right the way from the forecasting aspects to the political saliency and issues that it can bring up, and the importance of engaging civil society as an actor in that regard too. So we will now shift to some Q&A. We've got about 30 minutes for this, so we've got a roving mic. If anyone would like to kick us off by opening the floor, we'll give that a few moments, and if not, I have some questions as well for our presenters. Any questions from the floor at the stage? Yes, Miles? Excellent. Oh, we'll just have the mic come, and then if you just say, everyone knows you, but name and institution.
Thank you. Yeah, so hello, I'm Miles Allen, Oxford Net Zero, and it's a question for Jacopo about the definition of carbon removal itself in the UNFCCC, and the fact that for most players, probably in UNFCCC, it also includes the passive response to the biosphere, forests growing faster because there's more CO2 in the atmosphere, which sort of introduces this 20 gigaton a year ambiguity in what a carbon removal is. Now, it doesn't seem like we're going to resolve that anytime soon. So I wondered what your thoughts would be about whether we need a conversation about a time deadline for phasing out the practice of offsetting fossil fuel emissions with nature-based removals in general, sort of accepting that will always be ambiguous.
Maybe we collect some and then we answer. How do we do that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, unless you've got any immediate thoughts, but also happy to see if there's any further ones that we can collect. Amazing. Okay, so you can take it away and let them.
Well, it's, as you know, it's very complicated to have these kind of discussions being printed on paper in any decision at the UNFCCC level when sometimes it takes years to have a concept, permeating the conversation at some point. This could happen, referring to what you were saying, perhaps through the new NDCs and NDC cycles, as more and more countries will insert goals in that sense, will insert novelties. And in this sense, I'm thinking that, that the global stocktake process happens 2 years before every NDC cycle, and not just as a stocktake ex post. It's also thought of informing the next NDC cycle. And I think that it could be an opportunity towards the next one in 2028 to have, my bias is really strong here now in terms of thinking of the CRB as a good concept. But to inform these conversations towards a new global stocktake, as formally under Article 14, these decisions then become part of the regime. And when it comes to limiting the scope to nature-based solutions, when it comes to everything related to offsetting emissions outside of what it's written in the national plans in terms of approach here, I'm saying that could be the way. One key aspect, perhaps in terms of governance, would be to understand how much countries are really providing attention to GST decisions. We thought in Dubai that piece of paper would have become a central part of the story, and this has not been the case since Baku on, and it would be interesting to see what happens in Belém. For sure, this kind of reasoning, this kind of approaches are not entering the system through the dialogues that the UNFCCC organizes from time to time, even though it's useful to have these contents shown there. But if at the single country level, and I'm thinking of big influential jurisdictions, there is a push in that sense. And I'm not saying a majority, but a good number of NDCs walk in that direction, perhaps you could have this kind of approach entering negotiations the next time. But it takes years. It takes years for sure. And it's really linked to the timeframes that I was mentioning before. We cannot expect anything to happen before the next global stocktake, I think.
Fascinating. Thank you, Jacobo. Any further questions from the room? Yes, Mostyn.
Thanks. Mostyn from A3. Question for Alice, actually. So I really like that you brought permanent carbon removals together with conventional CCS. And I was just wondering if you got it the right way around in terms of who's scared of who. So you were saying that the CDR space might be victim to the CCS kind of taking over. But if you think of corporate willingness to pay, CDRs go in excess for $200 a ton, and no one wants to buy, CCS credits for under $100 a ton. So just questioning whether you've got that the right way around. Maybe actually the CDR will dominate and CCS will be the younger brother, if you like.
Thank you. I mean, I think that would be great, right? But we need to, I think in terms of having it the right way round, you've got the CDR credits, but you've got to be careful about whether those credits are permanent or just CDR in general, because a lot of credits can be nature-based. And so then you get companies jumping at it and then going for the credits and then still not having the engineered CDR scaling up. In terms of why, put it like this, the kind of CCS first and foremost and then the CDR, is because the way the supply side mandate that we were discussing is designed, is it's putting that burden to scale up geological storage on producers and suppliers of fossil origin carbon, so coal, oil, gas, limestone. And a lot of those will involve process emission captures, so point source. You've also got some things that you have to deal with to get to net zero, so hard to abate, cement processing, etc., that will need CCS. And I think the way that CCS has developed up till now, it's been primarily on that point source side, right? So that's where the early pilot projects have been. There are some kind of DAC projects going ahead, big one in America forthcoming. But I suppose that's why they're ordered like that. It might be cheaper if those are the entities kind of driving this forward. It might be cheaper for them to do CCS at the start. And so if CDR does take over, great, but we've got to make sure that there is room for it, I think.
It's super interesting because I know we also have some DAC and VEX developers in the room with us today as well, so fascinating insights well over coffee. Any further questions from the audience?
Injy, I have a question.
Yeah, please.
if I may.
Cool.
So, Jacoba, I really liked your talk, and I liked what you said about at the regime level, the UNFCCC and the UNCVD, it's quite limited to nature-based solutions at the moment. And I thought, what if we, and a question to you as well, Injy, what if we ran with kind of this idea of you presented as using it as a test site, right, to do the NBS side of the CRB. But what if we also ran with the geological storage CRB implemented? Could that work? So you break up the CRB and have it operating in different zones. At the hierarchy regime level, it's doing the NBS. But then because geological storage and engineered CDR is much narrower, maybe it could just play out in those specific policies dedicated to it. I don't know.
Yeah, well, it's something we toyed with, in doing the modelling for that, global carbon removal budget. Again, how do we distinguish and kind of, match the emission demand again in that like-for-like manner that we've brought up. And it's interesting because again, a lot of it comes down to the granularity of data that we have available. And we examined a number of pathways. These were limited to the ones that IPCC had assessments on that also again spoke to the kind of $100 limitation. But I think this prospect to adapt it to certain pathways or to certain political processes. And I thought it was really interesting, Jacoba, when you mentioned also Article 5 under the Paris Agreement. And, I think there's tons of synergies that, after developments last year and I think moving forward that we are increasingly seeing this attention being paid to how do we reconcile the need to, develop the coming protocol and framework within the Paris Agreement and how to ensure that these don't undermine each other. But I think Article 5 is a really interesting test case for how that may not go ahead. But I think there is value in disaggregating that, and I think that's a bit of a call to action, especially for those with speciality in either the nature or the engineered solutions to kind of how to take that forward, and then use these to inform these policy decisions. But I'll pass it to Jacoba.
Yeah, in that sense, it's also useful to remember that what happens at the IPCC level, what is written in IPCC assessment reports, doesn't automatically inform the UNFCCC negotiation text, agreements, whatever you get to. That to say that it's quite strange at the moment in 2025 not to have anywhere in the Paris Agreement or the first global stocktake decision figures, specific goals, targets for removals at this moment, because the conversation perhaps politically is not ready enough to get there, despite having the data. Also, there's a problem of fragmentation. This first part, of course, makes sense at the end. Okay, there's a problem with fragmentation in policies. You mentioned the London Convention and Protocol when it comes to subsea bed storage, for instance. How can that be so detached from everything under the UNFCCC at the moment? These two levels have no points of touch or link at the moment at all at the negotiation level, and that happens as well between Article 5 of the Paris Agreement and the Kunming-Montreal framework. This to say that testing the concept on a single policy domain on a single sector could be interesting, perhaps useful also to develop the concept politically in terms of political acceptance and governance acceptance. But there are so many different fragmented subsectors that should align in the sense that some sort of epistemical work, if you want, should be done in advance, well in advance, to prepare the conversation. Otherwise, the idea would just land in the room and die there within the first hour of talks.
And I think interesting, building off that, obviously, we've spoken about the Paris Agreement and the UNFCCC, but the sectors that sit outside of that, you know, aviation and shipping, and kind of developing solutions there. And again, you could, you know, limit the certain pathways that are applicable to geological storage for, you know, aviation fossil fuel emissions, and then, you know, maritime again, depending on those emissions there, and also the maritime pathways that we have available. But, you know, critically, a lot of questions there. And Jacobo, you mentioned that you got a few too about does ocean CDR kind of count within the carbon removal budget? And that speaks to its value as a framework that, you know, can be tailored to these different settings. Any further questions from the room at this stage? Yes. Sir.
That was handy. Oh, hi. Thank you. Sebastian Cross from B0. So, I mean, both papers were, I thought, really, really interesting, and kind of joining the two together somewhat. The discussion on mandates, I think you're right, it's very easy to just tell people to do something and say it's up to you how you do it and let them figure it out. And so it's a nice mix of public and private. I guess the question is, have you thought about who you'd be telling and where they are and what that means for the need for that policy to be consistent across different countries? Because it starts to fall apart, obviously, if you need multiple countries to be saying the same thing to the companies that are responsible. But it's further then complicated by the fact that where those companies are based is different to where the storage site is likely to be. And so the interaction between the companies that you're telling and the governments, you know, that need to both be telling companies to do this and be giving away the storage sites, you do come back to the need for global cooperation, which, you know, speaks to your paper, Jacobo, in thinking about, you know, what role the UNFCCC and other bodies have in coordinating that. But I guess, yeah, to bring this back to an actual question, is that something you thought about in the paper, who you'd be telling? I imagine if you tell 20 companies, then you knock out a decent proportion of you know, what you want to cover. Thank you.
Great, thank you for the question. So this is, lots of time has been spent on this because it's a tricky problem to get around. And so mandates, I said, are very flexible, right? And the benefit of that is that you can develop them in your own kind of domestic context to how you want it. But, as you said, these fuels and the fossil fuel operators are often kind of international and globally separate. So how do you get around that? I mentioned that the EU in the Net Zero Industry Act had implemented an obligation under Article 23. So they set a target they want a union-wide 50 million tonnes of CO2 storage by 2030. And they said, and the oil and gas producers who are producing within the territory of the union, you're going to provide it pro rata based on your production from, I think, 2020 to 2023. And that excludes so many producers. It excludes, you know, the producers producing in the territory of the union is very, very small. And it leaves out the kind of imported supply and everything like that. But the reason why they might have done that is because they're wanting to build onshore geological capacity in the domain, and these companies there often have the most ability to do that. And I think that it could have been done, structured in a different way to accommodate it. And so you can structure mandates to have companies provide capacity, so injection capacity, transport. You can have them just mandate to store it themselves. And I think if you're smart about the way you structure it, you can get around these nuances of, okay, how do we factor in both domestic and suppliers, international exporter, importer, in a way that doesn't hinder some companies over others. Yeah, and so some neat compliance mechanisms are needed. You know, maybe rather than just being obligated to develop it, you're obligated to pay into a fund to help develop it. So it's a very live issue, and interesting to think how that would apply to CDR operators as well.
Just to, if I may, just a second on this, as you mentioned, international cooperation, when it comes to the UNFCCC, it's a no-brainer that anything like this would ever enter in terms of mandates, in terms of clear indications on what to do. The multilateral domain, of course. It could be that in a few years, if policies of this kind are enacted by very large jurisdictions, for instance, then through the NDC cycle, you will get to see some of the terminology, I'm saying in 10 years, on the topic, but for sure no obligation, which would be, yeah, again, an impossible task for any country to promote.
I mean, the international regimes are, you know, it makes it difficult to comply, you know, enforce obligations on people, right? Especially when they rely on, you know, consensus and voluntary.
Yeah, it's becoming a chat between us two.
Sorry.
But no, but especially as the whole regime is built on the Paris spirit and Paris idea that each country contributes with its own ideas. This is what keeps the Paris regime alive, despite all the turbulence that we notice around geopolitically. So, yeah.
And to build off that comment, I mean, part of the Paris Agreement was also recognising the role that corporates and other actors play in this space too. So as we move from this session, which focused on kind of global policy pathways and the opportunity to kind of build it into broader policy frameworks, we'll move in the next session, a fireside chat, into zooming in on corporate carbon removal demand and be able to have a kind of frank exchange about the realities and practicalities that involves, and including through the lens of carbon removal budgeting. Just like to thank both our presenters here today, Jacopo Bencini and Dr. Alice Effort. It's been a privilege to have you here and to set off our discussions today. We'll now move forward to our first refreshment break, so please feel free to head outside and grab some coffee, and we'll see you back here at 11:45. Thank you so much.